Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a really incredible paradigm-shifting piece of work by researcher and social economist Shurna Alexander Benjamin. It's called Beyond the Address, Naming the Patterns of Violence. Now, if you're a community leader, an elected official, a social worker, or a health professional, you're going to want to lean in, because this framework will fundamentally change how you view your intervention strategies. We're talking about why we absolutely have to rethink how we track and treat violence to literally save lives. Let's get into it. We're kicking things off with this incredibly powerful thought from Dr. Judith L. Herman. Why? Because as practitioners and leaders, our main job is to bear witness. We've got to build systems that don't just suppress reality or conveniently forget what survivors are going through. Benjamin uses this idea to really ground her whole argument. If we don't name violence accurately, we're basically participating in that forgetting. So, here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the myth of privacy, then look at how violence actually travels, uncover our institutional blind spots, talk about education and active prevention, and finally wrap up with pattern-based intervention tools. All right, Section 1, the myth of privacy and unpacking the containment narrative. You know, before we can even think about fixing our systems, we really have to look at the stories we've been taught about where violence belongs. Shurna Alexander Benjamin highlights this dangerous cultural myth she calls the containment narrative. Basically, it's that old, stubborn belief that what happens in the house stays in the house. Because family is so often tied up with ideas of status and protection, society kind of likes to believe that domestic violence is just a private family matter, a problem tied to a specific location. But here is the reality check. The myth treats violence like it's a feature of a building, right? Like a broken window. But the reality is that violence is more like a heavy backpack the perpetrator carries with them absolutely everywhere. It's a continuous pattern of behavior. It doesn't just stay in the house because, well, it's not about the house. It's entirely about the person choosing to use violence and control. Moving on to Section 2, how violence actually travels, moving beyond the address. So let's look at how this plays out in real life. Imagine a woman experiences intimidation from her partner at home in the morning. Then, midday, that same partner uses surveillance tactics and stalks her at her workplace. By the evening, he's publicly humiliating her at a social gathering with friends. It's the exact same perpetrator inflicting continuous, overlapping harm on a survivor across completely different sites over time. The location changes, but the pattern definitely does not. And this leads to a hugely crucial point. When a victim leaves a specific household, the danger absolutely does not end. In fact, studies show the period right after a survivor leaves a relationship carries the highest risk for lethal violence. Perpetrators don't just miraculously stop their behavior when the victim walks out the front door. The behavior just travels to the next location. Which brings us to Section 3, our institutional blind spots, and how systems fail to track these patterns. This is a massive blind spot for elected officials, HR departments, and health professionals. Right now, our human service systems treat each site as a completely separate event. We literally separate workplace harassment from domestic violence and community violence. And because of this fractured setup, survivors are forced to navigate multiple different entry points, constantly repeating their trauma, only to realize our legal and clinical categories don't actually capture the reality of what they're living. We really need to shift to tracking the continuous, overlapping harm. To fix this, Benjamin argues we have to make specific administrative changes to shift our whole paradigm. We've got to move away from passive crisis response, which is really just reacting to isolated incidents at specific locations after the damage is already done. Instead, we need to pivot toward active social prevention, where we actually track and interrupt these continuous patterns of behavior early on. All right, Section 4, Education and Active Prevention, Changing the Story. So, how do we actually achieve this active social prevention on a broader cultural scale, especially without having to pass complex new legislation? Benjamin outlines 3 really practical steps to dismantle the normalization of violence. We can start right now just by improving what we already have, starting with media literacy education, moving into community bystander intervention, and creating low-barrier disclosure entry points. Let's break these down. First up, media literacy. We all know the entertainment industry regularly aestheticizes violence, right? Romanticizing coercive relationships, framing jealousy as love. Media literacy education is a real game changer here. We need to train journalists to adopt a clear point of view on violence rather than just reporting isolated sensational incidents. And we've got to teach students to critically analyze pop culture so they can spot unhealthy dynamics way before those dynamics start to feel normal to them. Next up is our community response. In our own neighborhoods, we have to challenge the language of harm. Perpetrators absolutely thrive when their manipulation goes unquestioned. But when a community member steps up and shifts the question from victim blaming, like, why didn't she just leave, to how can we support, everything changes. We need to create low barrier, non stigmatizing entry points where people can safely disclose abuse without needing a strict legal label that they might not even identify with yet. And finally, Section 5, Pattern Based Intervention Tools, a guide for practitioners. Let's get into the highly actionable tools for social workers, health workers, and allied professionals doing client assessments. Look, if you only ask a client about an isolated incident, you're going to overlook the full destructive reality of what they are experiencing. But by adopting a pattern of behavior approach, you get massive clinical benefits. You shift accountability right back to the perpetrator where it belongs. You validate the victim's pervasive fear. You identify non-physical abuse like coercive control, and crucially, you get the data you actually need to accurately predict lethality risks. So, here are some specific, pattern-based questions from Benjamin's work that you can drop into your intake forms today. Ask things like, how does your partner dictate your daily routine? Or how often do you change your behavior to avoid conflict? Notice how these aren't about a single punch thrown in a living room. These questions reveal the continuous relational dynamics at play. They expose the violence that travels with the victim across literally every space they occupy. This defining thesis from Shana Alexander Benjamin really perfectly summarizes the systemic and clinical shift we absolutely have to make. The name we give violence might mark the site, but the real work of ending violence requires us to follow the behavior, not the address. So, I'll leave you with this. As you look at your own institutional workflows, your HR guidelines, your clinical assessments, how will you shift from tracking sites to tracking patterns? How will you actively prevent violence in your community today? Take these insights, update your practices, and let's stop treating violence like a building and start recognizing it as a pattern we can actually intercept. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.